So it's so wonderful to have you all join us. And we are waiting for a few more audience to check in. And in a few seconds, we will start our IDEA.Talk. Good afternoon. Welcome to our IDEA.Talk, the Everett Friedheim Tourism Institute, Department of Tourism, Hospitality, and Event Management, and Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Access, Dean's IDEA Council in the College of Health and Human Performance at the University of Florida are presenting to you IDEA.Talk. It is my honor to introduce Dr. Robert Thomas, our moderator and one of the speakers today. Dr. Thomas is Darden Restaurant's Professor of Diversity Management and Assistant Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in the Wharton College of Business. He is an expert in the areas of intellectual property, technology law, and negotiation, and has published multiple articles in these areas. Dr. Thomas teaches intellectual property, e-commerce law, technology law, business law, and negotiation courses in the Wharton graduate programs. His courses are typically among the most popular elective offerings in the UF MBA curriculum, and he has received awards for excellence in teaching and research. Professor Thomas graduated from Princeton University with honors in economics. He received his JD and PhD in economics from Stanford University. Dr. Thomas will introduce Mr. Benny Vaughn and Dr. Everett Mccorvey and facilitate today's program. Audience, please type your questions in the chat box. Our speakers will answer your questions during the Q&A section. Dr. Thomas, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Rachel. Let me make sure that I'm not muted. Seems to be working.
Yeah, good.
Okay,
Good.
yes, okay, thank you. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And I am so proud to be here, and I'm honored to be with such illustrious colleagues on this panel. I will first introduce Mr. Benny Vaughn, who is an illustrious alum of the College of Health and Human Performance, who is known as the father of sports massage. He came to UF in 1969 as a track athlete, one of the first 5 Black athletes in any UF sport, and he specialized in the half mile, where he became a record setter. I might add that I also ran the half mile as well in college, but I was nowhere near record setting. His pioneering efforts in massage made him highly sought after by elite athletes, and he served as manager for athlete medical services in the 1996 Olympic Games in Atlanta. He has also worked on multiple other Olympic Games, NCAA, national, and world athletic championships. He has won numerous awards for his groundbreaking work in massage, including being named by Massage Magazine as one of the most influential contributors to massage therapy and bodywork. He is also very proud to have been inducted into the College of Health and Human Performance Alumni Hall of Fame in 2010. So, Mr. Vaughn, thank you for being part of this panel. I will next introduce Dr. Everett McCorvey, who is a tenor soloist, conductor, and professor of voice at the University of Kentucky. He is the founder and music director of the American Spiritual Ensemble, the director and executive producer of University of Kentucky Opera Theater, president of Global Creative Connections, production and management company for musical and theatrical events, and the artistic director of the National Choral. He is a native of Montgomery, Alabama, and has received 3 degrees from the University of Alabama, including his doctorate of musical arts. He has performed in venues and theaters worldwide, including the Metropolitan Opera House in New York City, the Teatro Comunale in Florence, Italy, and the Queen Elizabeth Hall in London. He has performed in productions of Porgy and Bess at both the Radio City Music Hall and the Metropolitan Opera House. Dr. McCorvey has been active in all areas of the performing arts business, from performer to musical director, stage director, voice teacher, producer, impresario, orchestra conductor, union rep, administrator, and mentor. He declares that music is my soul and has a passion for offering music to all. His life clearly reflects this declaration. Hopefully I haven't missed out anything. You two are phenomenal and incredibly accomplished. Anything to add or say before we jump into the Q&A?
Well, thank you for that great introduction.
Yes, thank you. I'm excited to be here, and I'm looking forward to this time together. And it's always great when you read so many wonderful things about your colleagues.
Absolutely. So I am going to start with a question that some might think is obvious, but it's one that in these times and ages probably bears repeating. So we'll start off with, why is inclusion, diversity, equity, and access, IDEA, important to achieving excellence in your particular fields? And we'll start off with Mr. Vaughn, and we'll move on. We'll go back and forth between the speakers, between the panelists.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Thomas. Inclusion and diversity is what brings about balance in our ecosystem on the planet. If we look at inclusion, diversity, equity, and access, and how that operates in the ecosystem on the planet, you begin to see how one segment is reliant on the next segment, which is relying on the next segment, with the ultimate goal of balance. And that balance in human physiology, homeostasis, is what allows us to be well, healthy, and to access all of our faculties of potential. So when we apply these very universal laws of nature to society, we can achieve that same balance. And I believe that the simplicity of making the comparison to the nature and the environment that we all live in on this planet is a great way to both scientifically, metaphorically, and in the level of awareness of fact, demonstrates that this is the best method for the growth and progression of a society. Voltaire is credited with a quote that I once read over a south entryway into Norman Hall. And that inscription above that entrance into the School of Education read, "A society is judged by how it educates its young." So when we're born, we're not born with any real prejudices. We're not born with any hatred. We're not born with any anger. When we appear in this world, we are as close to truth as we may ever be in our lives unless we make the effort and utilize a structure to maintain that. Because from zero on, we are conditioned. We're conditioned by what we hear. We're conditioned by what we see. We're conditioned by what we are taught. So when Voltaire says a society is judged by how it educates its young, that education must include diversity. It must include all members of the society. It must include access for that society to prosper, to expand its thinking, and to move forward. So our education systems are a primary source of preparation and conditioning to allow our society to grow. And that is why I believe that this is so critical to the survival of the human experience.
Great, thank you so much. Dr. McCorvey.
Well, I want to say first, that's a brilliant answer. And thank you so much for that and setting the stage for this, the beginning of this talk. I think balance, and especially in your work, that balance is so important. All I can think about is when I go to the doctor for my knee and he tells me that it's not my knee, it's my hip, or it's something else. It's my back, it's my hip, because everything has to be in balance for it to work well. And there's something that you said, Benny, that I want to expound on, and about training people when they're young, that we all come out of the womb with no malice and hate, and these are things you have to be taught. And it reminded me, in my world, I'm a musician, and my world has evolved around music for pretty much my whole life. But there is a song in the show South Pacific, if people know that show, and your words, Benny, sparked the lyrics that came to mind when you taught about that. And I'd like to just read the lyrics of a song that's in South Pacific. Think about when South Pacific was written, Rodgers and Hammerstein. And the words are, you've got to be taught to hate and fear. You've got to be taught from year to year. It's got to be drummed in your dear little ear. You've got to be carefully taught. You've got to be taught to be afraid of people whose eyes are oddly made, and people whose skin is a different shade. You've got to be carefully taught. You've got to be taught before it's too late, before you are 6 or 7 or 8, to hate all the people your relatives hate. You've got to be carefully taught. And that was true when this show was written, and that's true now, is that these things, hate has to be learned. Exclusion has to be learned. All of the things that segregation has to be learned. These are not things that we are born with. And so what excites me about this sort of discussion is that it gives us an opportunity to reflect on the fact that part of the behaviors that we are experiencing in our country are behaviors that have been taught to us. And so how do we unlearn those things and be reminded of things that speak to inclusion, diversity, equity, access, which then achieves balance?
Excellently stated. Excellent. How important is the history of people of African ancestry in America in advancing IDEA in American society? And I ask this question because recently there's been an assault on the teaching of American history. Black history is American history, but an assault on the teaching about slavery, about the Jim Crow era, about the lynchings, about the exclusion. So how important is that knowledge and the spread of that knowledge? And we'll start with Dr. McCorvey this time.
Well, that's a great question. And I have to say that I go back to my own history. I grew up in Montgomery, Alabama during the Civil Rights Movement. My father was a deacon at the church where Reverend Ralph David Abernathy was the minister. My family lived about 2 blocks from Martin Luther King when he was in Montgomery, Alabama. And they were very involved in the civil rights movement. I also did not go to a desegregated school until I was in the 7th grade. So we were segregated in Alabama until the late 60s. And so I was in the 7th grade when I went to my first integrated school, and quickly realized that what was being taught there was very different than what I had been taught as a child. Part of that difference was the exclusion of history about my own people. And I wonder how I would have been different if I had grown up from childhood and not known any of this history. What type of person would I have been? But because in my elementary school years, I was taught about African American history, I knew who my people were and the contributions that they made. So what concerns me now is that if we're not teaching this information to our students, how will they learn and appreciate the sacrifices that our forefathers and foremothers made to give us the opportunity for access, diversion, inclusivity? These things are happening because there are people who paved a way for us to be able to do and be who we are today. And so my great concern as we try to take history out of the schools is that we're just going to grow a group of, I'm sorry, ignorant people who won't know anything about the history of their own people or history about this country. I mean, it worries me, for instance, that civics is not taught as much in high school. When I went through, I learned about the American government through civics, and I learned about the workings of my city through my civics course. Where are the kids learning these things today? And so I hope that our country can continue to fight and work towards making sure that history is taught in our schools so that our students who are growing up will understand what this country went through in order to be a free, democratic society.
Excellent answer. Excellent. Benny, your thoughts?
Thank you, Dr. McCorvey. So I grew up not far from you in Columbus, Georgia, right across the Chattahoochee River.
That's right.
Phoenix City.
That's right. I know it well.
So I grew up in the deep South also. And I went to a segregated junior high school, Marshall Junior High School, which was right across the street from Tom's Peanut Factory. and the railroad tracks. And on the days that they were roasting peanuts there,
Oh.
it was tough being in school at Marshall Junior High School in Columbus, Georgia. So anyway, I'm from that same neighborhood.
Yeah.
And I think history, American history, must include the history, the participation, and the contributions of African Americans. It has to. It is part of American history. Though parts of that may be and can be painful and difficult to learn about, to hear about. In Birmingham, Alabama now, the museum that highlights the number of lynchings of Black folk in America that occurred makes many people uncomfortable. But to grow and expand, we have to be willing to be uncomfortable in the interest of progress. I can remember having one of my very wealthy white male clients who utilizes my facility. I operate a very large and successful athletic therapy center here in Fort Worth, Texas. And he came in for a therapy session with me, and he was talking about a movie made by Quentin Tarantino, Django Unchained. And he was saying to me how much he disliked that Tarantino movie, just how they depicted African-American men and slavery and the fighting and the turning of dogs onto slaves. And he said it just made him so uncomfortable. He really didn't like that movie. And I paused for a moment and I said to him, I said, well, you know, sir, that reflected the truth. That reflected the truth. Because those types of events happened on a regular basis in America. Putting slaves in hot boxes, castrations, lynchings, those things happened. And I'm reminded that Emmett Till's mother insisted on an open casket because she wanted Americans to see the brutality of racism and segregation. She wanted them to see this is what it looks like. This is what it looks like. These just aren't words. Here is physical evidence. Here's truth of what it looks like. And when I look at this history, I'm reminded of, again, talking to one of my white female clients. And when things were becoming very volatile and vocal in America about history. And I said, well, you know, the situation that happened with Emmett Till in Mississippi, and her response was, I don't know that story. And that, for me, was an indication of why the need for history. Now, a lot of people know about the Holocaust, though there are those who purport that it never happened. But it's important for us to be uncomfortable in the interest of growth. And that means that we must study it, we must learn from it, and we must be willing to grow, even if it's uncomfortable. And we hear about growing pains when we're all young and we're getting taller and our feet are getting bigger and our joints are hurting. But in the end, you're an adult, everything is moving well, you feel good, and all that you went through was now worth it. And I think that this is worth it, that all of American history should be taught. All of American history should be taught. And my heroes growing up, because I wasn't very far from Tuskegee, Alabama, were the Tuskegee Airmen. And when I was at Marshall Junior High School on career day, I was in the 7th grade, and I told my Black counselor that I wanted to be an aeronautical engineer. After she finished laughing at me, and she said to me, you know, son, Negroes don't do that. Why don't you think about being maybe a barber? But aeronautical engineer? No, you can't do that. And I remember how devastated I felt. And I remember thinking, but I've heard about these Black men in Tuskegee, Alabama. Like, they're flying airplanes. Like, why can't I do that? And so I'm 70 years old right now. And that stuck with me and still sticks with me. But what it did, it inspired me later in life as an adult. And now I have a pilot's license, instrument rated, because I was determined, even though that counselor said, Negroes don't do this, I always said to myself, one day when I'm able, I will fly airplanes. And I have a pilot's license now. And that was inspired by the Tuskegee Airmen. So history not only is important for us to grow, but it's important for inspiration.
That's brilliant. I mean, I think that's just so wonderful. I think of the phrase, those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. And, you know, I think that's certainly, as we're looking at what's happening now in Europe, and all these are very, very important things to note, that we must always stay vigilant and stay ready and stay aware of what is going on. You know, I was thinking about another article that came out a few years ago maybe 2 years ago with the New York Times. It was the 1619 Project, and talk about being uncomfortable. I would encourage anybody who has not read the New York Times 1619 Project to read it. It is uncomfortable for everyone. And of course, the result of that is that it received a lot of criticism. But there were so many truths in there. And so many times the truth is uncomfortable. And so I would encourage people to read that.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I love, Dr. McCorvey, your statement about the repetition of history. That is so problematic, and you're right. It is happening in Europe, and you would think that people who are supposedly that smart would avoid doing it. Benny, your field is so apropos to this, because when you talk about discomfort, that's what you do as a trainer. You put people through discomfort, and I'm sure they scream at you and they shout at you. They get very upset with you, but at the end of the day, when they see those improvements, they say, wow, that was worthwhile. So we do get better, we do get stronger when we suffer through what may be discomfort, but it is definitely value giving. One comment, you gentlemen are neighbors or grew up as neighbors. I grew up in the North. I grew up not far from Emmett Till's family. And there is the myth of the great North, the giving and caring North. And no, No, the North has its issues as well. I grew up in a place called Evanston, Illinois, which is just outside of Chicago. And right now it is facing its own horrific past. And it is trying to deal with some of the issues of segregation and discrimination through reparations. And that's not a question that we're discussing today. Perhaps it is one. But definitely without understanding the past, we don't know how to move forward to the future. And so I'm going to skip over the next question I had because I think we have addressed it. And so in the interest of time, I'm going to ask, how do we engage in constructive discussions about race, equality, and justice with those who may not be open or supportive of these ideals?
Well, I want to start with I want to continue on something, and then I'll answer that. When you talked about reparations that you all are going through, that they're going through that in Illinois, that was probably the number one thing that I gleaned from those 16, 19 articles, that it's going to be economically, it's probably difficult to almost impossible for this race to catch up, because the African American race, because there's first a 400-year head start in so many areas economically. And so how do we as a people catch up with that 400-year head start? It's impossible. And so that was one of the frustrating things for me reading that article, in that, you know, it begged to question how we do that. In your question about how do we engage in constructive discussions, I think that we have to start with the premise that the discussions will be difficult, and we have to create a safe space where people are willing to realize that these conversations may not be all rosy as we discuss the challenges. You know, I think of the Black Lives Matter movement that really took hold over the past few years. And of course, we were in isolation as all of these things were happening. And I thought about, how is the Black Lives Matter movement different from, say, the civil rights movement in the 60s? And I think back to the civil rights movement in the 60s. And one of the things that I have thought about a lot was that not only were we dealing with a group of people trying to find equal rights under the law, we were dealing with the battle of being stereotyped as a certain type of people. And so you had a few, yes, we had whites who were involved in the civil rights movement, and you had people who realized that Blacks should have equality, and they worked toward it. But we were not only working for that being equal under the law, we were working against the stereotypes that had been placed on us. Now look forward to the Black Lives Matter movement. What did we see in the Black Lives Matter movement? We saw a lot of young white kids out there marching and saying that this is not right. They were marching along with their Black colleagues and classmates. The difference is these kids in the Black Lives Matter movement, they have grown up in a more diverse environment. They started diversity. Most of these were in integrated schools from kindergarten. And so most of these kids, many of them probably had sleepovers with their Black friends. They had dinner with their Black friends. They went to Disney with their Black friends. And then all of a sudden, these young people are seeing that there is unequal treatment happening in our society with the people that they grew up with. And so now it's not necessarily the stereotypes that they're battling against. They're saying, wait a minute, this was my friend from elementary school. We played soccer together. We played football together. We have been together, and all of a sudden you're saying that because of structural racism, that they can't have an equal place at the table? That's not right. And so I'm very excited and hopeful about the Black Lives Matter movement and what it's going to do for our country as we move forward. As these young people get into positions of authority and positions where they can make change, they're going to have a different outlook than back in the 60s when you had a smaller group of whites involved, although we absolutely had whites involved. But I think it's going to be a very different discussion. And so these young people are going to demand a discussion about race, about equality, about justice. And I am extremely excited about that happening in our society.
Great. Benny.
That's awesome, Dr. McCorvey. That's awesome. Yeah, I think the meaning that we assign to what we perceive is a key component. So when a white American assigns meaning to seeing a young African American man walking down the sidewalk wearing a hoodie, the meaning that that white American assigns to what they are perceiving is the core of why history, education, discussion, group meetings is so necessary. And I look at so many cases that we have seen. The young massage therapist in Colorado who was walking home from the 7-Eleven, and the meaning that those white police officers assigned to what they perceived when they saw this young Black man simply walking down the sidewalk. And in the body cam video, one of the officers, when the young man asked, why is he being stopped? The white officer replies, "You're acting suspicious." So that was the meaning that that white officer had assigned to what he was perceiving. And this is the underbelly of racism. This is the underbelly of discrimination. And so it becomes important for us to all understand that all of us have dominion over what we think. We all have dominion over what we think. How you decide what you think is based on education, history, discussion, and your personal life experiences. And this is why having discussions and group meetings, though uncomfortable they may be, you will grow, because now the meaning that you assign to your perceptions of what you see, what you hear, what you touch becomes different. And it becomes different in a way that is inclusive and engaging. And that's why I think it is so critical. And I make it a point when I have discussions with white Americans who ask my opinion or thoughts on a current event. And when they ask, I gladly provided, though it will make people uncomfortable. And one of the ways that I demonstrate this to white Americans who ask my opinion on things, I say to them, I said, have you ever wondered in your mind, where did all these light-skinned Black folk in the South come from? Did you ever wonder about that? Did you ever wonder, where did all these light-skinned Black folk in America come from? Because those Africans that came off of those slave ships in Savannah, Georgia, and other ports were not light-skinned. There were no tribes in Africa with light skin. And I asked them, have you ever thought about that? You ever wondered about that? Now that discussion makes people uncomfortable, but no one's ever thought about it. I shouldn't say no one, but these individuals that I've spoken to, and they begin to think, and I'm going, yeah. And I said, I'll give you a clue. In America now, we would probably call that systematic rape. That's what we would call it. And so that's a place that I personally begin discussions with white Americans who ask my opinion and want me to share. And I just speak truth. I just speak truth. And it is not my intention to just make them uncomfortable, but it is my intention to speak truth, and their willingness to be uncomfortable in the interest of growing is a decision that they must make. And so I think discussion is important.
Absolutely. Absolutely. No doubt about that. I love the way that you engage our white colleagues and contemporaries. That is a great way to start what is clearly an uncomfortable but necessary subject. My next question is, what resources such as churches, mentors, schools, etc., have been important or critical in facilitating your successful navigation through American society? I've skipped a couple of questions in the interest of time.
Well, I will, if we go back to the civil rights movement, and, people, even when I talk to my kids, sometime I have 3 kids, and, when they were young and we talked about the civil rights movement, they thought that was a whole different, world, century, not just 50 years ago. And because as you know, it has not been that long. But if we look back to the civil rights movement, even prior to the civil rights movement, after the Emancipation Proclamation, where was the main avenue for communication? That main avenue for communication was the church. And so if you went to a Black Baptist church in the 60s, you'd have your prayer meeting at the beginning of service, and somewhere in the service, you'd probably have 15, 20, maybe 30 minutes of announcements where they told you everything that was going on in the community and what was happening. And so that was a major place for Blacks to find information about what was going on, what needed to happen. And I think of the Montgomery bus boycott, where that was planned and discussed in church. And so from the church, it went out. And the fact that our world's most influential leader was a Black Baptist minister, that's because that's where the information was disseminated. And so in this day and time, there's the question, where are we disseminating that information that used to be disseminated in the church. And so this is one of the reasons why I feel that education is so important. And it is so important for our African American, it's important for everybody in America, but it's especially important for our African American brothers and sisters, because this is where they will have the opportunity to learn about history and learn about what's going on in the world. And so as a as an educator, I'm constantly trying not only to get students into college, but I'm constantly trying to convince them to get a master's degree or a doctoral degree or some level, higher level of certification, so that they can continue to be educated, so that we can find out that information. People aren't attending church at the same level that they were in the 60s. And so, we're getting our information now from, Facebook and, Instagram and a lot of the social media. And then, you get the televisions and you can find a channel that has your ideology, and that's where you get your information. But education sort of crosses all of those boundaries and barriers. And so I feel that one of the ways that we have to continue to encourage our young African American kids is to, and kids who come from depressed areas, Black or white or any color, education can be that key and that way out.
Excellent.
Yeah, absolutely. Education is education nourishes the soul. Education nourishes the soul. And I believe another component that has been massively helpful for me is having mentors. The Tuskegee Airmen were mentors to me, though I met one of them later in life, but just knowing that they existed and knowing what they were doing across the Chattahoochee River in Tuskegee. And one of the ways that I honored them as my mentor is back in 1995, I had my pilot's license, instrument rated, and I took off in a Cessna 172 from Peachtree DeKalb Airport in Atlanta and flew to Tuskegee and landed on that same exact airfield where the Tuskegee Airmen trained, walked into the FBO, the fixed base operation, and walked around the old hangars where the Tuskegee Airmen, because I wanted to feel their spirit and their mentoring energy that drove me to follow and to come from my dream to fly airplanes. And so mentors make a difference. So what I say to many leaders and educators, especially in the African American community, kids are always watching us. They're listening to us. They're watching what we do. So a 2-year-old is taking a lot of mental notes, watching their parents, listening to their parents. They're taking more mental notes than they may be given credit for. And it's being stored away until it's activated by a life experience that they have. So mentoring is direct and indirect. So young people just hearing about what you're doing or what you've achieved or seeing it or touching it or listening to it. Mentors make a difference in helping young people, Black, white, Asian, Latino, of all shades. It helps us to shape our meaning that we assign to what we perceive in our society. So I pay close attention when I'm around young people. And for me, especially young African-American boys,
Mhm.
because I know that they're taking notes mentally by my behavior, listening to what I speak about, watching what I do. So mentors play a huge role. And for me, when I look at those that I felt mentored by, and I'll just end on this. So I grew up on 22nd Street in Columbus, Georgia, across the street from Rose Hill Baptist Church. And on Fridays, young men who were part of the Black Muslim movement would come into the neighborhood selling fish. And what stood out for me as a young boy, I was so impressed how well dressed they were. They all had suits on, finely pressed, close cut haircuts. Man, I mean, they look good. The bow ties, the starched white shirts, shoes so shine. And I was just like, man, wow, look at these guys. I'm just a little boy. I don't know anything about the Black Muslims, but what I know is what I saw. And they spoke real well. They were always very respectful to my mother when they would knock on the door and ask her if she wanted any fish today. And I just remember, man, when I'm able to, that's how I'm going to dress. And later on in my career, I did. When I would be teaching, I'd wear a bow tie and all. And one day, a white student said to me, "Are you a Black Muslim?" and I said, "Why?" Because you like wear this bow tie. So it just goes to show you that people are taking notes and you're mentoring people directly and indirectly by your actions, by your words, and by your appearance.
Wow, that is such a phenomenal answer.
Oh.
And it's got me to circle back to an earlier question that I passed over. And and I'm coming from a business background. And one of the questions I get is, can you still be true to yourself while climbing the corporate ladder or by pursuing some of these traditional paths that are called success? And Dr. McCorvey, you talked about going on to get graduate degrees. So how do people from marginalized communities navigate and succeed in American society while honoring their true cultural identities?
Well, that's a great question, and I have to say, Benny, when you gave that story about flying into the airfield and walking, and that just moved me so, because that is the power of mentorship, just in terms of they were mentoring you even when you didn't even know them, because of the accomplishments that they strove to achieve during their lifetime. That's a powerful, powerful story. And it certainly made me think about the mentors in my life who were all music, again, not going to a integrated high school until I was in the 7th grade. And then it just turned out that my band director was Black. And so for my 7th, 8th, and 9th grade, I wanted to be like my band director. And then went to high school, and Montgomery was still struggling even in the early 70s. And it turned out that my high school band director and choir director were Black. And so when I went to college, what did I want to do? I wanted to be like them. And that really set me on a path. So I agree, mentorship is so important as we move forward. And Robert, in answer to your question, I would say that truth is still important. And we must be true to ourselves, to our communities, to our professions, and we cannot substitute anything for truth. And so as you're working to climb the ladder to be successful in your field, Keep your eye on the prize. And what is the prize? The prize is truth. Do the best that you can for your society, for your family, for your community, so that you develop the skills and the gifts that you were given. Because each of us, I talk about this a lot, I feel that God gave everybody gifts. He gave some more than others, but everybody has a gift. They have several gifts. And so what do we strive to do? We strive to develop our gifts so that then our gifts can help give us access. Our gifts can help us to give influence in our community. Our gifts can help to develop that truth that we should be striving for in our fellow man. And so I encourage people listening to really work on trying to find what your specific gifts are, and then using those gifts to then make the world a better place. And it only takes one. And so don't feel that whatever your gifts are, really work to achieve those.
That's awesome. So here's something that I keep at my desk. So when I'm meeting with people and the discussion, I just pick this up on my desk and I just hold it up.
That's great.
And because I'll just close with this to your question, Dr. Thomas. I think the first step is at the level of fact, conditions, and circumstances, you may be marginalized, but at the level of truth, you are not. You're only marginalized if you believe that and accept that. So at the level of fact, conditions, and circumstances, you may be marginalized, but at the level of awareness of truth, you are not. So when you believe that you are not, your access to your gifts are now expanded, and you put your actions into coming from whatever dream or vision that you have. For me, it was flying airplanes.
Let me ask you one more question, because Rachel tells me that 2 p.m. is a hard stop. And this is a question that I really wanted to hear from you. And I think our students will really get something out of it. Living in today's society is clearly challenging in all sorts of ways, physically, mentally, every way you can imagine. So what can we do individually and collectively to maintain our physical and mental health in this adverse climate?
I'll let Benny answer that, because he's
Benny is the clear expert in this field.
So what I believe is that every morning, 7 days a week, 4 weeks a month, every day, and this began with my grandmother, who used to give me these little booklets called The Upper Room.
Oh, yes.
Which was from the AME church.
Yes.
And I would read The Upper Room every day as an adult. I read something positive and guiding for 15 minutes, sometimes 30 minutes, sometimes 10 minutes. But I start my day with that sort of input into my mind. I do not input the morning news. I do not input the talking heads. I input something that helps my mind to feel and be expansive and positive. And I think as long as you are nourishing your soul with education and knowledge that uplifts you and influences your thoughts, which influences your feelings, which lead to the actions that you take, which dictate your results in life.
Thank you.
That's brilliant. I will only add that my motto that I tell my students all the time is don't let anyone steal your joy.
That's fantastic. Rachel, I think, is here to tell us that we've run out of time and we're just getting warmed up.
Yes, let's stay till 2:05. First of all, thank you so much for your time and your insights, Mr. Vaughn, Dr. McCorvey, and Dr. Thomas. I have learned a lot from your talk. I have been so moved and I have tears in my eyes. Thank you. Especially so many wonderful words you mentioned. Truth is uncomfortable, but also truth is the way to set us free. Understanding the past can help us move forward in truth freely. Thank you so much for you all, friends, colleagues, and students. I appreciate you and your presence. I hope you enjoy our webinar as much as I have enjoyed having you as our audience. It's our Black History Month, and I want to thank you all for celebrating the Black History Month with us together. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.